We're making bread today. First we're going to have a rundown of the ingredients. You need a 1/4 cup of warm water. The water should be between 105 and 115 degrees. I have an instant read thermometer. If you don't have a thermometer, you can just put your pinky into the water, stir it a little bit. It should feel just a little over warm. Just a little over warm, a little hot. You don't want to go too warm because too much heat will kill your yeast. And here's the yeast. It's active dry yeast. I'm showing what the Fleischmann's package looks like. I buy yeast in bulk from Red Star, so I just measure out a tablespoon. To feed the yeast, I give it 1/8 of a teaspoon of sugar. This bread recipe also has 2 teaspoons of salt. You can roughly measure the salt by just pouring it out of the container into your teaspoons. One of the nice things about bread is that the precision of measurement isn't the same as, say, for making a cake. 2 tablespoons of sugar is in this recipe. 3 tablespoons of melted unsalted butter. If you don't have unsalted butter, it's fine to substitute regular butter. Then there's 2 cups of milk. The milk is also warmed to about the same temperature as the water for the yeast. You can use any kind of milk. This is low-fat milk. You could use non-fat, whole fat. You could probably even use soy milk. Then there's a cup of whole wheat flour. Again, very roughly measured. I just dip it into my container and pull out about a cup. And then 5 or more cups of bread flour. The amount of flour you add will just depend on the texture of the bread. You look for a certain condition when you're done kneading. This is the rest of the equipment we need to make bread. This is a 4-quart mixing bowl. I like the shape of this bowl. It's got nice steep sides that make it easy to stir against, but it's got a good sized bottom as well. A fork to whisk the yeast and dissolve it in water. Rubber spatula to mix, wooden spoon to mix, and then this is a hard plastic scraper to scrape the dough out of the bowl. And then I've got 2 8-inch by 4-inch bread loaf pans. These are glass. You could also use metal. If you don't have any bread pans, the loaves could be shaped into rounds and placed on a cookie sheet to bake. Okay. Starting with our milk in our bowl. I actually warmed the bowl up a little bit so that it wouldn't steal heat from my warm water. Sprinkle in the yeast, the little 1/8 of a teaspoon of sugar. That's nicely mixed. Now set your timer for 5 minutes. The yeast needs to grow and develop for 5 minutes before the other ingredients go in. Okay, this is what it looks like after the 5 minutes. The yeast has grown quite a bit. Nice bubbles. It's much thicker. It's foamy. So, good start on the yeast. This recipe then has you add the warm milk, the butter, salt, sugar. Blend that up a little bit. And then it calls for 3 cups of flour to be added. This is where I like to add a cup of whole wheat. I like the flavor that it adds. See how I'm sort of breaking up the clumps against the side of the bowl. That's why I like a kind of straight-sided bowl. So that's 2. Again, just kind of about a cup at this stage for sure. And in general, bread is not a super precise recipe. When I was little, my mom used to take leftover pancake batter. If we hadn't used it all up at breakfast, and she would throw it into the bread for the bread for the day. If you have eggs that are getting older and you want to use them up, throw them in your bread dough. There's just a lot of flexibility that you can do with bread. I like to do a spatula at this point because I can scrape the side of the bowl nice and clean. I think the recipe says something like beat it for 50 strokes. I've never counted strokes. You can see now that it's not as lumpy, it's more put together, it's getting to be a little bit, have a little elasticity to it. So when it's roughly this thickness, the batter rather is about this thick, this is a good time to just mix it, beat it, stir it for a couple minutes. If you want to set a timer, great. Not essential. This is if you had a stand mixer, this part could be done in the stand mixer with the flat beater. The other thing that's happening is that the moisture in the recipe, milk in this case, is being absorbed by the wheat, in particular the whole wheat. And allowing that moisture to absorb affects ultimately how much flour you're going to add. So if you give it that time to absorb, you're going to end up adding the right amount of flour. Too much flour added to the bread dough, the final shape of the loaf is a little bit off, and it's it's just one of those learning experiences. I tend to go for on the lower side of how much flour I add to my dough. Okay, that looks done quite a bit of beating. It's come together pretty well. It's still quite thick, but I'm going to add more bread flour. I added it as a cup at a time. At this stage, it'll still absorb that cup fairly well. Notice I'm stirring it more slowly so I don't make a giant puff of flour all over myself and my counter. Now this is too wet and too sticky to dump out onto the countertop. It would stick to your hands and it would be quite a mess. So what I recommend is that when it gets too thick for the spatula, you want to switch to a wooden spoon. And instead of doing a full cup, we're going to go half cup this time. Maybe not even. So where the flour is on the outside, it's cutting down on the stickiness. It's not sticking to the bowl. The more I stir, the more it's going to stick to the bowl. So I'm going to add a little bit more flour on the edge, and I'm going to stir some more. I'm almost doing a kneading motion inside the bowl. Again, that's why this kind of straight-sided bowl works well. Now it's pretty much a ball, a very sticky ball, and I can keep adding a little bit of flour and try to mix it in with my spoon, but that's getting harder to do. Okay, so it's a very rough mass, but it is a ball. It's sticking tenaciously to the wooden spoon, and that wet part is going to stick to the bowl. But this is the time we can turn it out. Go back to my rubber spatula, scrape off my wooden spoon, spatula's stiff enough I can almost scrape the bowl with that. And I think here's a place where it's good to understand how much flour to put out on your board at this point. Pretty thick. About like that. This is not a light dusting like you were rolling out pie dough or something. This is more. So it's a mass, but it's sticky. And I'm going to kind of pour it out on top of my flour. These bits left in the bowl, I find really don't knead into the dough well, so I tend to scrape the bowl as clean as I can and throw them out. And then when we're all done, the kneaded dough is going to go back into the bowl. I don't grease the bowl, I don't grease the dough. I just haven't found that to be necessary. So there's our bowl, which will receive our dough when we're done kneading it. Now, cover the dough with a similar amount of flour like you did below. Perhaps that was, I'd say it was at least a half a cup. Now, this is a very sticky mass, and I'm rotating it just to say, okay, it's not sticking to the counter. Now it's a gentle press, push, pick it up, fold it over, rotate it, fold over, gather, push, rotate, push. The flour is escaping, so I'm sweeping the flour back underneath my ball of dough. Push. Every time the flour escapes, I'm recapturing it and putting it under. I am not pressing very hard. The dough is very soft at this point. It hasn't absorbed that much flour. But it is clearly, even within just that short period of time, it's much more put together than when I poured it out of the bowl. Now I will continue to knead this until that all of that dough, all of that flour rather, that I poured out at the beginning has been absorbed. So push, fold, gather, push with your palm, fold, gather, push, fold, gather, push, fold, gather, push, fold, gather. Collect the flour that's trying to escape and get it underneath your ball so that you're continually kneading into the flour that you poured out. I don't have too much flour on my hands. No dough is sticking to the work surface. And the dough's getting more substantial. Push, fold, gather, push, fold, gather, push, fold, push. Now, see how much less flour there is than when I started? And my dough is a much different consistency. You don't want to pull too hard and tear your dough apart. That just makes the sticky part. You're trying to kind of keep the skin intact. Push, fold, gather, push, fold, gather. Getting closer now to having that initial batch of flour be absorbed. It's feeling very good, that first bunch. And I'm able now to knead without a lot of sticking. Push, fold, gather. Sort of continually bringing the bread back into a ball. Okay, now as I'm doing that, tell it isn't done. So the surface here at this point, it's pretty rough. It's kind of tearing apart. I mean, it's not very sticky. It does come back a little bit when you push it, but this is not done. Something that you could do, which I do sometimes, is I stop here for, say, 5 minutes. And again, letting that moisture absorb is going to impact how much more flour I'm going to add to this dough. So I think in this case I will do that. I'll be right back. Okay, had a little resting time. Now I'm going to put considerably less flour on the board and keep kneading. Now your flour is more about allowing the dough not to stick to the board and not to stick to your hands, as opposed to really trying to add more flour to the recipe. And it's really not sticking. That rest time was helpful. That I sprinkled in maybe 2 tablespoons of flour, so that's fairly absorbed. And it's not sticking to the board. The dough is not sticking to the board, but I am feeling it under my hands. See, it looks much smoother. And I'm getting a feel for, as I continue to knead, is the stickiness coming back. And I can feel it feeling a little more tacky. Kind of like a Post-it note now. It's just tacky. It doesn't stick to my hand, but it has a little Post-it note kind of feel to it. Alright, so I'm going to add just a little bit more. I'm putting more flour in my hands and knead a little bit more. Now I'm continuing that kneading, and I'm not getting very much of that tacky feeling as strongly coming back as it did. Now it just feels smoother. Now when I press it, it bounces right back. So now I would say there's enough flour in it, and additional kneading would just be about developing more gluten. But this feels done to me. That Post-it note tackiness is gone. This is nice and smooth. You press it and the dough bounces back. There's just a nice smooth feeling to the dough. And just under the skin, see some air bubbles developing. Very, very lightly. Alright, this is done. Make it into a nice ball. Pretty smooth. Put the seams at the bottom. Put it back in the bowl. And I'm going to cover it with a damp tea towel. A tea towel. Just a very light towel. I wash it, I dip it in water, wring it out. I'll put it in the microwave for 10 seconds to warm it up and then cover the bowl. Okay, just get a good sense for it. That's how the dough looks like when it goes into the bowl. And they always say, rise until it's doubled. And we'll see what doubled looks like. I will put it in an oven that I've turned on for 1 minute and then turned off. If it's summertime, I can just leave it out on the counter. It's warm enough. It's not warm enough today, so I'll be putting it in the oven. All right, our bread is risen. It's nice and up over the top of the bowl, so we'll take it out and shape it into loaves. Okay, so I smashed it down before turning the camera on, but anyway, that's kneaded into this is my solid plastic spatula. So I'll do that too fast. Okay, so here's the cut part. Fold in, make a nice ball, and then roll that ball into about the length of the loaf pan. There's our loaf pan, about like that. Press it down into the pan, and I will do that with the other loaf. Okay, now the second loaf. Kind of knead it into a nice cohesive ball, and you're pushing some of that air out of it. And then roll it evenly till it's about the size of the loaf pan. The recipe will say seam side down. That's what they mean. That's the seam. So seam side down into the pan, and then I press it until it's evenly into the corners, and I grease this pan before putting the dough in. This is what I do for the second rise for the loaves. I put them in the oven, and I put a shallow pan at the bottom, and I put hot water in it. Most recipes will have you cover it with a tea towel or or wax paper or something. I consistently find that whatever you put over the loaves sticks when you try and take it off, and you don't get a nice clean loaf that way. So this way there's moisture in the oven, it's warm, the loaves rise nicely, you don't have to peel anything off before you bake them, and I really like this method. Okay, it's been 40 minutes. This is about how much above the edge of the pan you want to see the bread. I really wouldn't want to go any higher than this. One of the failures you can get in making bread is that if it gets too high, it gets too fragile, and then when you put it in the oven, it collapses. So this is great. I'm going to take the bread out of the oven right now and get it heated up so it can start baking. Okay, here's our loaves. They just came out of the oven. I usually whack the side of the pans and they release pretty readily. A lot of the recipes say, oh, if it sounds hollow on the bottom, it's done. That's the hollow. If I'm going to have warm bread, I usually let it sit for 5 to 10 minutes. I do set a timer. And then we'll cut a slice open. Alright, the bread's still hot, but I'm gonna cut one slice off just so you can see what it looks like inside. Pretty much any serrated knife will work to cut bread. I have an electric knife that I use all the time, but it's perfectly fine to cut. Good texture, good crumb, as they say. Very tasty bread, great toasted. And it's just delicious hot bread. What could be better?